start with the shameless plug for School of Energy Resources. Our mission is energy-driven economic development for Wyoming. That's what we do. We show up at the office every day, we roll up our sleeves, and we go to work for the state of Wyoming. And what we're hoping to do is maintain that energy leadership for now and way into the future. We've now got about, We've now got about 50 staff members at the School of Energy Resources. 70% of those are Wyoming graduates. So these are kids that are coming down to Laramie to be trained, and instead of losing them out to Denver or to Houston or to those other energy markets, we're able to grab those smart graduates and put them to working on Wyoming energy problems. I'm Director of Research, so this is how we organize our research at the School of Energy Resources. We have several different centers of excellence. The Center for Economic Geology Research, that's the one we call KEGR. We stuff all of our geologists in that. Fred leads that center. We've got a Center for Carbon Capture and Conversion. Right now, a lot of its focus is coal to products, and so the director of that center is Trina Pfeiffer. She's sitting here in the second row. We do a lot of work with 3D visualizations. We have a 3D visualization center that works closely with this center here at Gillette College. We stood up a hydrogen energy research center a couple of years ago to kind of think about what are those emerging energy markets for hydrogen and what opportunities there are for the state of Wyoming. We have several centers that we work with faculty members that work on challenges that our industries are seeing every day. So like air quality, managing produced water, biogenic natural gas research works on coal bed methane. We've got a wind energy research center and now a nuclear energy research center. So we're identifying those different pockets where we can have an impact within Wyoming, and then we organize a smart cluster of faculty and PhDs around it to work on those problems. All right. So just what are some of the things we work on at School of Energy Resources? We do a lot with carbon capture, use and storage. Carbon engineering is our coal to products program. We do oil and gas production. Anything we can do in visualization to work and help with community outreach, but also to help engineers talk to geologists, to mathematicians, to economists. Methane detection and mitigation. We do a lot with rare earth elements and critical minerals. Looking at coal markets and coal sales. What's the future of coal? Combustion. We do a lot of work with energy policy and economics, just making sure that we're peeking over the horizon and developing those energy policy levers that are needed to advantage Wyoming energy. Hydrogen, nuclear, of course, produced water management, geologic research. We've got a whole list. All right. Okay, so we do a lot here in Campbell County. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those projects, and then I'll hand off to my colleagues here. So we have a project that's called CORE-CM. That stands for carbon ore, rare earth elements, and critical minerals. So the carbon ore part is coal. That's a building block that we use to make different products. So that's Trina's center. And we'll talk a little bit about what she does. But hopefully we can come back and really dive into her program. Rare earth elements, that's a really exciting opportunity for Wyoming, right? Mining is in our DNA. If we can figure out ways to get rare earth elements out of the ground economically and get them to market, I think there's a lot of opportunity around rare earth elements, especially for Campbell County. And then critical minerals just kind of expands on that list of rare earth elements. So we've got two projects. We're kind of working statewide, but a lot of the focus is right here in the Powder River Basin. It's looking at the Bear Lodge deposits. It's looking at rare earth elements that are associated with coal. It's looking at rare earth elements that might live in produced water. So this is a really exciting and emerging area of interest for us. All right, the Wyoming Carbon Safe Project. Fred is going to talk about this one in detail, but this is a really large flagship project, not only for us, but for the Department of Energy. And Fred will talk about how there are a lot of national eyes watching this project and hopefully watching this succeed. All right, one more, Jim. Dave will talk about the Integrated Test Center and the carbon capture technologies that are being developed there. So we'll hear some highlights from that. And then our last one is we were soon to break ground. We've already broken ground. We're soon to stand up a pyrolysis demonstration project. So what does that mean? So we've got a, what we're developing is a coal refinery. And Trina, you're going to jump in and tell me when I say something wrong. But this coal refinery has two kind of arms to it. One is coal pyrolysis. So that's taking coal and making coal char, which we can use this char as a building block for a lot of different construction materials. We're standing up a demonstration project to look at this pyrolysis. This will be housed at the Wyoming Innovation Center and in operation probably next spring. That's what we're looking for. Okay, so this is a really exciting part of our work. But this is the program that makes a lot of different construction materials. So they're taking coal, they're breaking it down into the very different components of carbon and putting it back together. And one of the products that is getting a lot of national highlight right now are these coal char bricks. So these are bricks that are made out of coal char. They're less dense, they don't burn, they have a lot of thermal capacity to them, so they're a much better insulator. So if you come down and visit us on the campus, University of Wyoming, you'll see a house down here that we built out of Wyoming coal products. And what these two houses are doing right now, the one on the right is built out of traditional materials. The one on the left is built out of coal-based materials. And so we're testing the two. We're looking at things like, how does temperature differ between the two houses? How do they stand up to the elements? What is sound quality like? What is air quality like within the two houses? And so these products are getting ready to where they can move to market. So the demonstration facility that will be built here in Gillette will be taken into the next step. Okay, what we're planning and what we hope to get funded is the other arm of that, and that's the solvent extraction. So that's where we take all the different volatiles and all the different chemicals out of the coal, and we turn it into like petrochemicals. So Jesus, how many of you know? Trina, go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
so what the solvent extraction plant does is it takes coal and a solvent, and what the solvent does is extracts the liquids out, and we use those liquids, we modify it a little bit, and we make asphalt binder. So the main product out of that particular process is asphalt binder, and then the residue, the solid that comes out of that, will go into the pyrolysis unit to pyrolyze for our coal char. So that's.
So this demonstration facility, if we get it funded and built, will pave a road out of Wyoming coal that we can show the whole world what we can do with Powder River Basin coal. Okay, so we're here tonight to talk about carbon capture and storage. So I'm just going to kick it off with just some very fundamental slides, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Fred, who can take us much deeper. Unintended. So the first thing I want everybody to take home, why are we standing up here? Why are we talking about carbon capture and storage? Why is it important?
Calling a student like we would in
Why is it important? This is why I feel it's important. Wyoming exports about 90% of the energy that it produces. That leaves the state as a rail car full of coal, natural gas down a pipeline, electrons down the wire. But the truth is, we make a lot of energy in this state, and we are leading the nation in energy production. But it's not used here. It's being sold into other markets. It's being shipped to the southeast, to Texas. Texas buys more coal from Wyoming than any other state. In order for those markets to stay online, they have to serve customers that want decarbonized energy. They want carbon-free energy. And so for a state like Wyoming that depends on sending all of that energy out, we need to be able to provide them those carbon solutions. So why is carbon capture and storage important to me? I want to figure out how to do it. I want to figure out how to do it here. I want to figure out how to do it successfully. And then we want to export that technology to all those different customers that are buying Wyoming energy. If you take one thing home today, I want you to take that home. That's why we're working on carbon capture and storage. Okay, so just a few other things as we're getting into the lecture tonight. When we talk about carbon capture and storage, it's actually not carbon, it's carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, when you burn it, when you burn coal, you make carbon dioxide. And in fact, the flue gas that comes out of a power plant is only about 13% carbon dioxide. So the carbon capture component is really just separating out that 13% of flue gas that we can capture and then store underground. When CO2 is injected, it's no longer a gas. So as we exhale, we're exhaling CO2, right? We're exhaling it as a gas. But when we capture it from a power plant and we compress it, it turns it into this dense phase CO2, which is more like a fluid. So when we're injecting CO2 into the ground, you should picture it more of like injecting water into the subsurface. When we're injecting it into a rock matrix, so pore space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, so I won't belabor it here. The other thing that's really important is we're putting it deep into the subsurface. In Wyoming, we're looking at like 8,000, 9,000 feet, even deeper. But almost any project is going to be 3,000 feet or deeper. And that is important because that pressure above where you're injecting keeps that CO2 in the dense phase. And so it keeps it, instead of a gas, in the dense phase liquid. Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit more about reservoirs and seals. So let's go on. Okay, so this is a very, very simple diagram of carbon capture and storage. You've got the power plant, right? That's your CO2 source. That's about 13% CO2 that comes out of that stack. You have the capture technologies that separate out that 13% CO2. Now, when you take that CO2 out, you put it up to a pipeline grade CO2, which is about 95% pure CO2 or more, and it's dehydrated. They pull all the water out. That makes it able to ship down the pipeline. Now, in places like the Powder River Basin, that pipeline could be really short. It could be basically coming out of the plant and straight down into the ground. In other places, like the Midwest, where they don't have carbon storage potential, that pipeline could be hundreds of miles. And in fact, it could be hundreds of miles back to Wyoming to store that CO2. And then when we store it deep in the subsurface, Brady, you're going to talk a little bit more about that, so we'll just keep this moving here. So what does Wyoming's emission sources look like? So there's the state of Wyoming on the right, 50 square, right? The green dots show us where we have CO2 emissions. The size of that green dot tells you how many tons per year they are emitting. So our biggest emitters, here, this is Jim Bridger Power Plant, Larry River Station over here, Dave Johnston, and then the power plants up in the west. So coal-fired power is the largest emitters within the state. What are we seeing these other dots down here? This is trona mining. Trona facilities. So it's our industrial facilities. Probably the two biggest, most important industries in the state of Wyoming is what's being targeted for CO2 emissions. And so when we're working on these, we're very conscious. We know where the CO2 emissions are coming from and where we want to store them. But there's new things coming online that are going to have CO2 emissions, like hydrogen production. And so as we develop CO2 storage, it's going to start helping us leverage additional industries. And in fact, direct air capture is another industry that's looking at Wyoming. And that would be taking CO2 directly out of the air. But why are they here? Because we have the storage potential to put that CO2 on the ground. Okay. So another state of Wyoming, or a picture of Wyoming, I just want to tell you where we are working. So we've got several projects across the state. So if you take the square state of Wyoming here, this purple line here is a CO2 pipeline that carries anthropogenic or man-made CO2 today across the state. It carries about 5 million tons. Project number one, you're going to hear more about from Fred. That's our Wyoming Carbon Safe project at Dry Fork Station. We've done a lot of work down here at number 2, the Rock Springs Uplift. So this is a large regional storage capacity that could probably take about 3 to maybe 10 million tons of CO2. So all of CO2, Wyoming CO2 emissions for about 400 years. It's a huge, really large storage project. Number 3, we're looking at some oil and gas fields that produce all the oil and gas out. And so now we're looking at turning those back over to CO2 storage reservoirs. Number 4 is a new hydrogen facility, a blue hydrogen facility that also depends on CO2 storage in order to get going. And then number 5 and 6 down here are large regional hubs, again, looking at places where we can store all of the industrial CO2 across the state. Okay, so I feel like I'm taking too much time, so I should be in it. Okay, so a few more concepts. Last time I was up here, somebody says, I can picture what a ton of coal looks like, but what does a ton of CO2 look like? So this balloon here kind of gives you the scale of what 1 ton of CO2 looks like if it were in this room. Now, if we take it and compress it and turn it into that dense phase, we can get into really small volumes, and that's what we're injecting into the subsurface. All right, Jim. Fred, I think I should just hand over to you for my carbon safe. Let you go through these. Sure. Yeah. Let's go all the way forward. That's why I'm carbon safe. I'd hate to take it over this time.
Oh, no big deal. I'll let Matt go in. First off, any questions for Scott? Excellent. A question?
So one of the pictures had where you take the CO2 out from landfill and bring it back to the ground. There was like a step 3 that was generating more coal production. Did you go backward and talk about that? How does that work?
Sure. Let's take a look back.
That-
Is this it?
Yeah. See number 3 down there, utilize CO2 to increase oil production. Sorry.
I'll take a shot at that. Yeah, that's a great question. So that's called carbon utilization. And I'm going to start by explaining on this slide. That's the reason this pipeline exists. So Wyoming has done what's called CO2 enhanced oil recovery since the 80s. It's one of the first states to do it. This pipeline has been operating for decades. I'm sure we got folks here that like to work on their trucks or cars in their garage. You guys ever spill oil on the cement in your garage? You have. How much of it deep were you able to get up?
Not very much.
Not very much. And that was on the surface. Imagine 6,000 or 8,000 feet underground, right? We're very lucky in Wyoming to maybe recover 10 or 15 or 20% of the total oil in place. What CO2 does when it gets in the reservoir down in that pore space, it can actually make the oil less viscous, basically. And it can mobilize more oil, and so you can get more oil out of an existing old oil field instead of going and drilling 10 or 50 or 100 new wells, which an oil company's going to do anyways. So that's what CO2 utilization is, and that's what that cartoon step is trying to represent. Does that make sense? Great question.
And it's important to note that as the CO2 goes into the ground, it stays in the reservoir.
Right, just to elaborate on that a little bit, this, almost four decades of enhanced oil recovery in the state of Wyoming, this 5 or 5.5 million tons of CO2 that is distributed in that pipeline network serves EOR fields in Colorado, I believe 8 different fields in the state of Wyoming, presently 2 fields in Montana as that pipeline extends to the north, and is very near the Bakken production area in North Dakota. I think around 15 or 16% of all the oil produced in the state of Wyoming right now is produced only because there's CO2 injection, recovering that last bit of difficult to recover oil. So this is well-established technology. It's been happening for a long time. It's safe. It's profitable. And without that, oil production in the state of Wyoming would look a lot different than it does right now.
Thank you, Jim. Very good point. And for instance, Scott introduced the concept of volume or scale, which is hard to picture sometimes out of 1 ton of CO2. And you saw before that the state of Wyoming puts out somewhere like 50 million metric tons of CO2 per year. Salt Creek oil field, which is out here outside the Midwest, largest oil field in the Rocky Mountain Basin, has recycled over 125 million tons of CO2 through that field, to give you a sense of the total volume usage. That's the biggest one. There's other ones that have done 25, 30, 50 million tons. But that's your impact scale there for CO2 EOR, which is another great topic, you know, that Ron Whitman can raise his hand for. He's not even here. So, but thank you. Yes, question?
I have a question. So you said a couple of times, like, what is it about Wyoming's geology that makes it a good, you said something about the Midwest doesn't have the geology in order to capture it, but we do here. So what is that?
Why does Wyoming have the geologic resources to
Yeah.
do this? I promise I didn't ask you to ask that question, because that segues right.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's great, and please just raise your hand, students, anybody non-students. We do these talks all the time, it's way more fun to be interactive, because we don't know what you're thinking, right? We've thought about this a long time, we're gonna miss stuff that we can share with you, or at least maybe, you know, opine on. So this is some of the stuff we look at in geology, and this is just in the Black Hills. What we have here on the left is what we call a stratigraphic column. It's different named geologic formations that differ from other geologic formations. What we have on the right is a zoom in of some of the formations we're looking at here on the right, which is the Metallusa formation. That would have been back in the day, 300 years ago, give or take, near shore sand dunes that were privy to different rise and fall sea levels. So in fact, this is a period of Wyoming's history where we can look at the impacts of glaciers. So sand, we had glaciers, and the sea level was lower because a lot of water was trapped with the poles. And then, because of a lot of volcanism, it was actually when the Appalachians were forming, the sea would, the ice would melt again, and the sea would inundate that part of Wyoming, and then we get coral reefs, which you see there in gray. That is not quite on topic, but I'm getting there. This is what we're looking for in Wyoming, pore space. So this is core that we pulled out of the ground, and we make slides on it, and we look at it in a microscope, and we look at it in a microscope and stain it and do different things. You can see if there's porosity in that rock. And the porosity in this case is the blue stuff. We put basically blue glue in there, it dries up, and we can see where there's grains of rock that are just, you know, sand grains, in this case carbonate, or not. That's the resource we look for carbon geologic storage.
We'll go back one more, because I think we can answer her question. So, what you said about your question, what makes Wyoming great? Go back to the strat column.
Oh, sure.
Okay, so he talked about these really big, large reservoirs. So these are large reservoirs that you would find 9,000 feet below. Right, so these reservoirs hold oil and gas in a lot of places in the state. So what we're looking for is places where they don't have oil and gas in them. But also what makes Wyoming a great place is above this, and what you're looking at is a well log here, but above this we have this really fine-grained material. It's like we call it shale. But go forward just a couple more slides. But that really fine-grained material, if you look at a shale under a microscope, this is what it looks like compared to this sandstone. So this sandstone is where we would target to fill these pores with CO2, and it's capped by this shale on top, so it holds it in. It's like your ceramic coffee cup. When you pour coffee in there, that ceramic doesn't let the fluid go through. So in Wyoming, we've got really great reservoirs that are deep on top, and with these really big shales on top.
And thick, sometimes 10 or 12,000 feet thick. So
So
most
you
of the
guys
basin,
are looking for the sandstone that has.
sandstone and
the-
carbon with pore space,
Okay.
and above that. And a general rule of thumb in the basin is 20% of the rock, if you're lucky, porous. The rest is really fine grained and seals.
So these guys are really smart. I have to think about it in a simpler way. You know, if you think about these rocks that are at surface near the Black Hills in places that might be 8 to 10,000 feet deep here, while it looks like solid rock at the macro scale, it's made of sand grains. If you think about that like a jar full of marbles, okay? The jar looks like it's full of marbles when it's full, but there's still space in between each one of those, and you can pour water into that. So that pore space between each of those grains of sand is what you see highlighted in blue down here on this bottom left slide. And so, as Fred mentioned, a lot of reservoirs that are productive for oil and gas in other parts of the basin have 8, 15, 20% porosity. So that means if you have a sequence of that sandstone that's 100 feet thick, there could be 20 feet of it that is void space. That's the pore space. So you have 20 feet of empty space. Now, it's not empty, it's got salt water in it typically. But if you think about something that's 20 feet thick and it extends for miles and miles and miles every direction, it is a huge, huge volumetric capacity to store these tens or hundreds of millions of tons of CO2.
And thanks, Jim. We do, jump in, because we take it for granted, we think about it too much. One thing again that we know Wyoming, for instance, is very good at holding fluids in place, because we have situations like this, oil and gas. That oil and gas typically in what we call Laramide or Rocky Mountain basins or Wyoming basins was produced from 100 million to about 60 million years ago, and it's still there. Now there's some places that are still kind of active. We have Wyoming rocks that hold helium. That's amazing. Hydrogen. Yeah, so that's what produced the Chute Creek and stuff there. So we have very robust trap and seal systems, you want to think of it that way. And not everywhere, but in a lot of places in Wyoming. So that's one of the reasons that CCS is adaptable here. Relative to the Midwest, where you might have had events that cleared out a lot of the geology, like, giant glaciers coming through, you just don't have enough space, enough depth. But there's some basins too that don't even have very good porous rocks. We know that some areas around Cheyenne, for instance, have very limited pore space availability based on different depositional systems back in the day. Again, that's getting more in the weeds. Jim, you can raise your 2 minutes card. So, because what I'm here to talk about, it's a boring slide. We stole this from the federal government. We didn't make this. Is the Carbon Safe program. So Carbon Safe is the Department of Energy's flagship carbon storage program. It's a competitive program to try to facilitate carbon management options and carbon storage hubs in different basins in the United States. And one of the reasons that they wanted to fund this is the reservoirs that we're looking at, though they're porous, they hold salt water, as Jim mentioned, and not oil and gas. So oftentimes we have very limited data, because back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when there was a lot of exploration in Wyoming, if you drill down to a target and all you found was salty water, you were going to fire people, and you didn't care about it, and you didn't collect the data. So we kind of have a scarcity of data in some areas based on what we're trying to study. Now, Scott mentioned too that these are all phased approaches. The Carbon Safe, the one we're working on outside of Dry Fork Station is currently in phase 3. Phase 4 is commercialization. Now let me point something out really quick just to make it clear. At this stage, which is still a characterization, permitting, risk assessment, all this stuff to try to be as robust and safe as possible, there will be no CO2 injected at this period in those wells. So we'd love to get there, but that's not this phase. So just to make that very clear. Again, I'm sure a lot of you guys have driven up the road and seen Dry Fork Station. This is a really, really neat coal plant with respect to kind of how forward-looking it was, how long it wants to operate. It's really new. It didn't come online until 2011. They want to operate till 2072. And again, think about volume. This is what they emit per year, give or take. I think last year was closer to 3 million metric tons. But the goal is to try to find, with Carbon Safe, the program that we're studying from the geology standpoint, the storage potential to address that amount of carbon dioxide sequestration or storage over 30 years. That's the programmatic goal of Carbon Safe. So we're just trying to help identify that much geology to soak up that much CO2. Dave's going to talk about the Wyoming Integrated Test Center, so I'll go for it. That didn't work. No, it did work. There's an animation there. Interesting. So again, just to drive this home, a lot of geologists are taught to look for resource, right? You might learn to look for oil or gas or gold or copper. What carbon storage CCS geologists sand dunes. So this is the Melaleuca Formation. It would have been equivalent to Sahara type, deserts back in the day, back when we were closer to the equator, a little bit warmer. And you can see that there's a fair amount of pore space on this slide. Maybe 15 or 20% of the total slide there is pore space, but you can see there's a lot of variability, which makes it more fun for us as researchers and less fun for operation in the future, just a little more challenging. So again, another take home, besides for the reason we're doing this, as Scott mentioned, is the market dictates what we sell, and we sell power. There's nothing we can do about it. If our markets that we're selling to want low carbon power, we're at their whim. The other thing from the geology side is, I know you students have to write a paragraph, so the resource that we look for is pore space. So here's some fun cartoons that actually help you visualize what we're looking at and the potential impact. So on the right is a to scale cartoon picture of 2 wells that we drilled and outside of Dry Fork Station. There's one of the wellheads. Here's the depths. We went down to almost 10,000 feet. We cased both wells, and we targeted 3 different formations. You can see above this a fair amount of really tight shale, and then we've identified what the lowermost USDW is, because that's necessitated by the permit.
And what's a USDW?
Lowermost drinking water, underground source of drinking water, which is designated as a water that is about 10,000 parts per million total dissolved solvents. You guys know what seawater is? What's seawater parts per million? You shook your head, so you gotta know. I'll tell you twice, I apologize. Yeah, that's true, I didn't ask what seawater is. Before. So seawater is about over twice that. So, this is still relatively salty water. You wouldn't like drinking it, it wouldn't be good for you. But that's how it's designated. It's just kind of a little under half seawater saltiness. So what we've been able to do, based on a lot of the data we've collected in the field, which I'll talk about a lot, is build these really complex models and run tons of simulations. So this is a preliminary simulation where we tested what would the CO2 storage capacity look like if we threw in artificial boundaries. Like that's what are straight lines. That's what we get to do as a university. We get to do research and see what the impacts are. But what we have found is just using one of these formations, the lowermost one, that's well below 9,000 feet below the subsurface, we can easily meet Dry Fork Station's needs if we have enough injection wells in the region. Drilling in a little bit deeper, again, we got another cartoony cross-section. This is from a seismic line that we acquired. Seismic's a whole other science. We basically put energy in the ground. There's receivers that are spread out to listen to the energy. There's thousands of them. There's a lot of energy that goes through. There's thousands of signals, and it helps us build a subsurface map, basically. This is going from west to east, going up towards the Black Hills, down towards the basin axis. You can see it's getting deeper to the west. This is also has a 6x vertical exaggeration on it because it is dipping so shallowly at Dry Fork Station, you wouldn't really see much of an offset here. This is to show where we've placed one of our wells through this geology here, our total depth, and then we can get into more of the details here, the different, what we call lithophases. Is it sand, is it shale, is it actually salt? There's evaporites that live out here. And then on the right, we can take core data, which we captured at these wells, and look at porosity and permeability. Porosity we talked about, that's the pore space or void space in rock. Permeability is the ability of a fluid to flow through rock. There are plenty of rocks that are porous but don't allow fluid flow, so that wouldn't be good for CCS. What we like to target ideally are those rocks that are about above 10% porosity on this chart. So you can see that we definitely have those targets at Dry Fork Station. What's also neat about Dry Fork Station is we drilled 2 wells. They're less than 1,000 feet apart. Here's some core being retrieved from one of those wells, and we see that they are not completely the same because geology is complex. So this is an interpreted well log. So we stick a tool down the hole that measures different components of the rock all around it and tells us about the rock. But what we see, which is really interesting, is we were tracking this formation called the Lakota, which was an old fluvial, or older bed, I guess, right? Coming off some mountains way off to the west that no longer exist, back when dinosaurs were marching around. And we can see that on one of the wells, we were actually in the channel of the riverbed. There's a lot more sand. And the next well, we were off channel. So again, for us geologists, it's fascinating, it's interesting. But for, helping to develop these industries, it's one of the things that we look at a lot, is trying to understand how consistent these rocks are laterally and vertically. That's pretty straightforward, right, Jim? Good. One of the things we thought we should talk about tonight with this industry is risk assessment. So we talked about things to the question in the back there, CO2 enhanced soil recovery, right? So that's a very analogous industry. You guys know what that means too, right? Basically doing the same thing. Are there other industries that are very similar to CO2 injection that you guys know about? That are ubiquitous all across the United States? Anybody? Yes? I'll check on you, President.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd say wastewater injection.
Wastewater injection. Why is there wastewater injection?
So we dispose of fluids.
Dispose of fluids that we largely produce for oil and gas. So conventional oil and gas produces far more water than it does oil or gas. Usually 101 magnitude, 100 barrels of water for every barrel of oil, at least in older fields. So you got to get rid of that water somewhere. So one thing we do all over Wyoming is reject wastewater. Industry helps you, cook some food, stay warm in the winter. Natural gas storage. So we already store natural gas. There's natural gas pipelines around all the United States. There's natural gas storage facilities in geology in Wyoming, in Illinois, all over the Midwest and the West. And it's been going on for 100 years. So we're lucky as a science to be able to look at these natural analogs of commercial size gas storage, and then start to understand what some of the risks are. So not only is that the right way to, better understand what your impacts are, right? You don't want to have negative impacts if you avoid them, but also it's necessitated by the permit. So the permit for carbon storage is called a Class 6 permit. You don't have to take us on this or class if you were in the Army, you would. But it's one of the most rigorous well permit types there is. And one of the things you have to do is really in-depth risk assessment, which you don't have to do for other injection wells, at least to the degree you have to do it for CO2 injection. So here's some of the things that we study in our CO2 storage facility areas. Are there legacy wellbores, old oil and gas, that might pierce some of those sealing rocks, and cause a potential conduit for fluid flow? That's why they're there, right? You drill down so fluid from the subsurface can flow out. Are there faults and fractures that might be a risk? What's the potential loss to formation, which is kind of getting into the weeds a little bit? And is there potential for reduced seismicity? Are we pushing too hard on something and making faults and fractures move? So again, this is just an example of how we go through some of these things. On the table on the right is a classic example of a risk exercise, where you get a whole bunch of numbers, data, and subject matter experts in a room, and you argue for usually 2 or 3 days at a time. You rate your risk, and then you go back and develop this management plan as the project proceeds. You need this, you need to turn this into a regulatory agency before you can do CO2 storage. This risk management plan, most importantly, has to be tied to the financial ability of an operator to fix the risk as it comes up. So if there isn't a risk in that field that happens under CCS or carbon storage activities, it's immediately addressed and somebody's financially liable for it. It's another good take on. But the other thing is that informs is our monitoring strategy. So CCS has one of the most robust monitoring verification requirements, again, in almost any field outside of nuclear and some other dangerous type of things that NANCAN does. So this includes stuff like surface monitoring, soil wet gas, shallow monitoring for groundwater, and deep monitoring. We've done a lot of this in Gillette, so it's been a lot of fun, actually. So we've set up different direct and indirect technologies. Direct is something that's measured, like a quantity. Indirect indirect can also be quantity, but it can also be something like seismic data, trying to figure out, how natural seismicity in an area happens. So we just want to share that's the soil gas monitor that's right outside the outreach building downtown here in Gillette. This allows us again to understand what the baseline is before we do any other industrial activities. So we know what's a natural CO2 system like, what's a natural groundwater system like, what's natural seismicity like in the region.
So Craig, can I interrupt you?
Please.
Can you go back to the seismic truck?
Yeah.
So to give everybody some brain break, because we saw some data there, and that makes your brain hurt. But I want to tell a story about the seismic truck. When we were out around Dry Fork Station, we ran this truck, and if you're at Dry Fork and you look behind you, you've got Victoria Hills there. And so we're capturing a 3x3 square mile seismic survey over the area. And we sent the trucks up there to, go do that part. They'd never driven over rock like that before. And in fact, I think we ended up with 3 flat tires. And then when they put the seismic plate down, what do they call that? The shaker plate?
Yeah, the shaker plate.
When it sat down on the scoria, it started shaking. It ended up breaking the hydraulics on the truck. And so, of course, they were like, what kind of rock is this? We're like, well, it's scoria, it's paper. It's really hard. You should have known that. So sorry to interrupt you, but
No.
I thought that was a great day.
That was fun, and I was certainly going into really boring tangents anyway, Scott. But yeah, so these guys, though they've been all over the United States, they had not built their trucks to Wyoming standards. So that was a take home for them. And that balloon tire right there is, I can't remember now, 12 or 15 foot tall. So it wasn't a cheap day for this company when they lost 3 of them. But again, here's on the left, you have Dry Fork Station here. This is where we have our well site, so we did some more original testing. Just want to show you guys that we did a lot of work dispersing different baseline science monitoring stations all over the field area, both here and even controls. We have some in Gillette too, just to see. Same with the regional seismicity. And this was fascinating as well because, okay, say Google Earth, right? You guys know what those are, those big pits.
Cool.
Thank. And those coal mines do a lot of blasting. So we got a lot of free data from the coal mines on seismic activity thanks to just their normal operations. That was a ton of fun. The last thing I'd like to point out, because of this project, and Scott mentioned it, there's a lot of eyes on it. There's a lot of Wyoming firsts here, at least for this industry. So these were the first 2 wells. We drilled 2 wells. We drilled, assessed, and completed the Class 6 injection standards, which are more rigorous than other well types. There's corrosion-resistant material in the steel casing. There's chrome, and there's corrosion-resistant material in the cement as well. The assessments that you have to do to get a permit in the future are far more rigorous. Typically take a year and a half of a whole room full of people crunching data. This was the first monitoring network that designated and dedicated to carbon storage in the Rocky Mountain West. So, though there has been a long history of CO2 storage for EOR, and Exxon does a lot of acid gas and CO2 disposal, they didn't have these requirements that was specifically for saline CO2 storage. And last but not least, we just completed the first environmental assessment for CCS. That's a whole different class that you should ask your president to involve you in someday. So that's all my slides, I think, Scott. Happy to take questions and then pass on my comment. Yes?
Can you go back to that slide where you had like the 4 steps and you're at like the 3rd phase?
Oh, yeah.
You haven't got to commercialization. So what does commercialization look like? What does that mean?
Great question. What does commercialization look like? Well, let's just pretend that we were lucky enough to advance and it is a competitive program. We're not guaranteed that. And we would still necessitate Basin Electric as a site host and potential provider to allow us to go forward. We're not speaking for them. The next phase would involve construction, wherein you would put the other wells that might be necessitated to handle that much CO2 and to expand that monitoring network across your entire storage area as designated. And then operations would actually be taking CO2 from the source and putting it down into those wells over the duration
into that, into those,
Yeah.
storage?
Yeah, so you'd have to,
Be piped in?
you'd have to build a pipeline from your source,
Okay.
some pipelines to go to your different well sites, like they do in an oil field. They wouldn't be on the surface, they'd be buried for safety's sake. And then CO2 would be moving through those pipelines via a compressor, like they compress the gas into a dense phase, as Scott mentioned, to the wellhead. And the wellhead would accept that CO2 and then target whatever reservoirs are competent to handle it. In this case, those that have pore space.
Thank you.
Great question.
How much will this add to the price of our utility bills?
How much will it add to the price of utility bills? I can't tell you that, I'm a geologist, it's a good question. Yeah, so I know that's a major concern, you got, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's one reason for the research, is to figure out what does this cost, right? And is it economical?
Well, considering the pace of, construction of coal-fired power plants in India and China, will this ever be phased up to a degree that it actually makes any sort of difference at all?
It's a great question. I mean,
Yeah, great question, I'll pass to you, Jim. Two things, one, Indiana, China, right, a bunch of people bring that up, it doesn't matter to Wyoming. If California says we don't want your carbon anymore, we have no tax
It
base.
does if it's an unnecessary expense.
The second thing, which is very interesting, is there's an analog technology that was rolled out in the United States in the 90s, that's just like this, and had to do with power stations. Any guesses as to what that is? It's why Gillette moved in about 85. Scrubbers. So Larry Bird just put a scrubber on a couple years ago, it's $300 million, right? I don't know how much that affected the ratepayer, but it was required. Now we teach this in class, so I'll go back to thinking a while. So back when the acid rain, they did this because acid rain, right? So there's a bunch of acid rain in the east that wiped out forests and fish, and, and there's a major pushback environmental to take it under control. That technology at the time was not fully baked, right? There were some ideas of how to do it, but it was regulated, so we had to do it. Now, at the time, it was a political discourse, right? People were seeing the cost of electrons with whatever in the United States, and all our manufacturing was, tank, and back then it was the Russians, like the Rocky movie, they come in and take over. It got really strange. What ended up happening was GE and other companies developed this scrubber technology, implemented it across the United States, fixed acid rain, and then sold it to the rest of the world. So we actually had growth in our GDP from that energy mitigation technology. Now, speculative, right? I don't know if it's gonna happen here, but you've seen it happen before.
So Ben, we've talked about this before, the question of, it's the big question, right? Why are we doing all this stuff? Why are we as individuals dedicated to doing this? Why is the university spending money on this? Why is our state legislature, our governor's office, why is the federal government through the Department of Energy doing all these things? And when you said, because of India and China, it doesn't matter. Now, what you're presupposing is, does CO2 matter relative to global warming or climate change, and how do the impacts we make locally affect the global system? It's a fair question, and the answer is, it isn't gonna affect it much. But who it is going to affect is our state, our county, our mining companies, our power plants, our friends and neighbors that work at all the systems. So, CO2 emissions becomes a global issue when it's in the big blue sky, right? But what isn't a global issue is where our markets are. So what Wyoming does the best is sell coal, oil, and gas, and electricity. And where we sell those products are to domestic customers. I think we have 26 or 27 states that we sell coal to right now. We export 90% of the power that we generate in this state. When those electrons hit the transmission line, they don't know where they go, but there are regional balancing authorities. But I think there are 32 of the 50 states right now that have renewable energy standard portfolios implemented in their states. Right, wrong, or indifferent, whether you agree with it or not, not so fast. And there are people 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 miles away that their state legislators, their public utilities, or their regulated utilities, their public service commissions, their private corporations that produce power have already made decisions that disadvantage our energy resources, okay? We've lost half of the coal production that we had just 15 years ago. 480 million tons, I don't think we cracked 240 this last year, okay? Those decisions are already being made by other people, and they are saying in the marketplace, they have demonstrated a market demand for abundant, affordable energy sources, but also with a lower carbon intensity. And we can deliver that to them. And we should be willing to sell them the product that they're willing to buy. And that is energy sources with reduced carbon intensity. That's what all this is about.
Phil, well said.
Can we charge others to store their CO2?
Absolutely. That's one of the bigger picture endeavors, and I think one of you mentioned that the Rock Springs Uplift has the ability to store, what was the number, 400 years of all of Wyoming's emissions. Or why not 50 or 100 years of 10 other states' emissions? We can bring CO2 back to Wyoming because of lucky rocks. We have good geology. And we can put that CO2 back in the ground and solve the problem that they want to have solved. So that can be a revenue source.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the timing on that question is a good one, but, I mean, a tipping fee on CO2 that comes from other locations could be a revenue generator for the state.
So are these ones that you guys are in phase 3 of building, are they different from the ones like in Iceland and in Texas that they're?
Great question, so are they different? Yeah, so the one in Iceland is definitely different, it's using a whole different system, they're actually mixing CO2 with fluid, so you've got like a Coke super, right,
Right.
instead of like 1% CO2, it's 5, and then, but they can flush that through because they're a geothermal plant,
Right.
and they can move that amount of water, so that's what they're doing in the geothermal plant. One in Texas, I guess you're probably, Petronova is the one you're talking
Yeah.
about. Yeah, so Petronova, you know, it's down here, it was built for CO2 EOR, basically the capture.
So it's different,
Yeah, so,
okay,
yeah, and we haven't built the capture facility at all, there's the Dave will talk about this. That's the large cost, I mean, the overall project is the capture facilities right now. The wells and stuff aren't cheap, but they're certainly a little more off the shelf. And that's part of the reason DOE initiated this, right? Because there wasn't a lot of these massive scale capture facilities being built. So right now, the primary chemical process that we use for gas separation is called amine technology. And there's several hundred of them across the Powder River Basin, just they're smaller scale. They're taking the CO2 from natural gas or something that we produce. So to scale up, you know, to a large scale to handle a full coal-fired power plant, there's 40 or 50 of them across the world right now, and there's hundreds of more slated, but there's not a ton. So that's been part of the problem. That's why the DOE's funding this is, you guys know early technology, like wind and solar back in the 80s was, I don't know how much more than it is now, but the goal of this program is to partially, you know, help get through these uncertainties with geology, but also to help push these projects forward in a way that, you know, the more of something you build, the more costs come down too. So the Petronova capture facility was hand-built in South Korea, and shipped over on super tankers, and, you know, it's a one-off, so it was expensive. So we're the first coal scrubbers. More questions? We can do more at the end too, but I should pass it in.
Thanks, Fred. I think I don't think again. Maybe, we'll see. Okay, so we'll change gears here and talk about the Wyoming Integrated Test Center. Kind of how we're gonna capture this CO2, separate it from the flue gases and purify it so we can either store it or use it for something. If you heard about the Wyoming ITC, you might think it's fairly common, everyday, run-of-the-mill. That's absolutely not the case. It's very unique, very specialized. Really, there's only 3 similar sites or facilities like this in the world. One in Norway and one in Alabama. And then, of course, the ITC right here in Campbell County, just outside of Gillette, adjacent to the Dry Fork power station. If you want to look at the process of what's going on out at ITC, you're welcome to go to the website, a simple web search for ITC in Wyoming, ITC Gillette, we'll bring it up. But we'll look at the 6 steps just really quickly here on the process of carbon capture. We'll start off with mining the Powder River Basin coal, burning it at the Dry Fork Power Station to generate electricity. And then at the stack, or the flue gases, we remove the SO2 and the mercury and nitrogen, other pollutants like that we were talking about with the Clean Air Act. But then some of that flue gas, well, it all still has the CO2, but some of that flue gas is redirected off to the ITC. So real testing can be done with the different technologies to not only just have simulated gas, but have true coal burning power plant gas that's being used to make sure these technologies are working. And then once the gas is removed, you can permanently store it in the geological process we were talking about, or create products like Trina's group is working to do. So the overall goal of the ITC is to provide a technology-neutral test center to facilitate the new carbon capture technologies. And they're focused on prolonging the lives of power plants and other industry facilities, creating new opportunities for energy-producing communities, providing low-cost, reliable energy, preserving jobs, and protecting the existing tax bases. When we look at the technologies, you'll hear a lot of TRL levels. It's a technology readiness level. And it's just a way of grading how far along the technology is from kind of its inception and creation all the way to commercial industrial use. So the ITC is kind of focused on the pilot scale in the middle. It's a little further along than just academic studies and research, but it's not quite viable for maybe industry or commercialization to get their ROI or their profit that they want to invest in this technology. So again, ITC is focused on the pilot scale, TRL 5 and 6. We're looking at TRL 1 through 9. Maybe it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We can talk about analytical studies, laboratory bench scale, up to the pilot scale, pre-commercial, and commercial scale demonstrations. Still, maybe makes sense, maybe not. If you're used to megawatts as a measurement, we can look at those. We're looking at between 1 and 20 at ITC. Maybe you're familiar with that, maybe not. 4 to 6 years, it's a little more tangible. You can say, yeah, I know what a project takes when it takes 1 year, if it takes 6 years, or takes 10 years to develop. Millions of dollars, we're looking at projects that are running between 5 and 75 million in ballpark. That's a lot of money for me. I don't know what $5 million looks like. I see it on the screen a lot. But to give a little bit better visualization of what these projects look like at scale, these would be some projects. These aren't necessarily the carbon capture technologies, but you can see what something in a laboratory bench scale might look like, the size of the pilot scale, a pre-commercial demonstration. Those would be the sizes we're looking at here at the ITC, and then much larger commercial scale demonstration when the technology is ready to deploy. The people interested in ITC, CCS, stakeholder base, not only the folks that are directly involved out at ITC, the state of Wyoming, the University of Wyoming, specifically the School of Energy Resources. You had seen the Wyoming Energy Authority had operations, trying to just make that more efficient through one entity overlooking this, and that would be the SER working right now in tandem with the governor's office. Basin Electric, the rural electric co-ops, tri-state, and of course all the consumers using PRD coal. We were talking about where it goes and where it gets burned. All these stakeholders are interested in carbon capture technology that works, so they can continue producing their electricity, keeping their industries running. Of course, the PRD mines want to keep producing as much coal as possible for as long as they can. There's 2 Class 1 railroads right here that ship the coal out all across the nation. Looking for even bigger opportunities, not just the coal-fired power plants, but the natural gas power plants. We have a way of simulating the gas from a natural gas power plant by using the coal fire flue gas. So not only would we gain data and technologies for the coal plants, but we could also use that on possibly on natural gas plants as well. Just some pictures so you don't have to look at all data and graphs. These next few slides have pictures from the past 4 months with some activities out here at ITC. You guys lived through it, so you know this winter. You might not believe these are November, December, January pictures in Gillette, not much snow. But there has been a lot of activity the last 4 months. Construction of different vendors or tenants, as they're called, setting up their sites so they can do the research and test their technologies. Basically an overview of ITC. Move on to the.
Thanks, David. So we've talked a little bit about talked a lot about the big picture scenario of what all is going on across the state of Wyoming, various carbon flavored initiatives to try to keep our Wyoming industries in the game. And so we've talked about CO2 capture, we've talked about CO2 sequestration, and here locally, we like to think about what else can we do to think about coal in a new or modern perspective. Okay, society has been burning coal in one form or another. They think for maybe up to 3,000 years in some parts of the world. That business model is pretty well played out in terms of coal-fired power generation. It's ubiquitous across the world. In some countries, it provides 60 to 70% or even more of all electrical generation. That's changing in the United States. At one point in time, about 15, 16 years ago, coal accounted for almost 50% of all the electricity generated in the nation. That's down around 16 or 17% right now, I believe. Everything that coal has lost, natural gas has gained for the most part, with maybe a point or two of renewables, primarily wind and some solar. So a number of years ago, with Phil Christopherson, other folks from the Wyoming Business Council, we started to think about, what else can we do with coal to find value, and look at coal as a, say, crude coal, the same way we think about crude oil, and utilize coal as a feedstock for materials and chemicals. And so, about 7 years ago, I think, we started down the pathway. Is that right, Phil, about the timing?
8 or 9.
Okay, 8 or 9 years ago. I started down the pathway to essentially rip off the idea of the Wyoming Integrated Test Center, where it is around CO2 capture, utilization, and sequestration, about creating a proving grounds for coal to products as a demonstration facility. And that is the Wyoming Innovation Center. So that's a project that has been led by a local group that Phil Christopherson is the CEO of Energy Capital Economic Development, with some private matching as well as some Wyoming Business Council grants. Also federal Economic Development Administration grants, participation from our state at the level of the legislature and the governor, and the city and the county governments have all supported the Innovation Center. And
And what it is, I think it's scrolling on its own somehow. What it is a proving grounds, where we want to do the dirty work, develop the real estate, provide the industrial scale utilities, provide an air emissions permit for developers that want to take those ideas that are in that TRL 4, 5, 6 range. I mean, they've been validated in the classroom, they've been validated on the benchtop in the lab, and certain system components have been run individually. But where these ideas meet complete systems at the mechanical scale for the first time. So in any case, the Innovation Center is just north of Gillette. It's at the Fort Union Industrial Park. It's right across the street from the Wyoming Integrated Test Center, maybe a couple miles down the road. And we've got our first tenants lined up there at that facility. The types of work we will be doing, I have no idea what it's doing that. We're gonna keep flipping back and forth. The types of products that we look at with coal as a feedstock would be rare earth minerals, rare earth elements, critical minerals, activated carbon, carbon fiber, graphene, asphalt, we've already talked about a little bit, agricultural chars or soil amendments from that char, and a few other things. So we've got a tenant that is exploring occupancy there now that would produce a synthetic crude oil analog, a coal-derived crude oil. We've got a company looking at hydrogen production there at that facility. Remind me, Rusty, what else is other types of interests that have been expressed around the ITC?
The Wyoming Innovation Center.
I'm sorry, the Innovation Center.
Yes, other coal products.
Yeah.
Besides UW, SCR, there's also some requests for pure CO2 stream to make some different things from pure CO2 stream. So I think that's something we can explore.
There's a lot of interest.
Yeah, there's a lot of different coal to liquids, I would say, type processes.
Right. Yeah. So so when we think about supporting the coal industry, the lion's share of that, of course, is coal-fired power plants. And so we think about, I don't know how to hit the pause button on this thing, but we think about first CO2 capture, secondly CO2 sequestration, and thirdly, alternative uses for coal. So what are kind of the three legs of the stool that we have that are very unique right in our hometown, right? So in Gillette, Campbell County, in Wyoming, there's no other place on the planet that is able currently to offer all of these things from gigaton scale CO2 sequestration and the development of all of these processes. And we hope that we're on the leading edge of the curve that leads to a lot of success for our industries, for our workers here in this region. So let's see, were you gonna cover some more CCS?
I was just gonna wrap up.
Okay.
Great. But Jim, I just want to tag on to that. This community, this county is getting national interest on carbon innovation. It's becoming known as a carbon innovator. And you think about the story of Pittsburgh as it emerged out of its steel industry and it became this huge tech hub for medical research and house the Department of Energy. Like I just see, as carbon innovation evolves, that it could be here. This could be the center for that type of work. And that's how it's becoming nationally known. So I just want to applaud you and everybody else that's working at the Wyoming Innovation Center on the great work. Okay, so just want to wrap it up a little bit. So we've just been talking about Wyoming carbon capture and storage, but this is taking off globally. Look at the number of projects that are being considered now, just since 2020. Wyoming was a leader, and we were out in front first. Others are catching up. And so, to me, it tells me that this is an industry that's taking off. And we need to continue to be out in front. We need to continue to recruit those projects and bring them here. One more slide, please. So this is where all of these are taking off over the rest of the world. And so we've got a lot in the US. And now we did mention the so back back there saying, oh yeah, the Midwest. We do have some projects in the Midwest. This is all ethanol. So ethanol emits about a pure stream of CO2. So this is where CO2 is going to be captured. They've got to figure out a place to bring it and take it to. So these are where the projects around the world are taking off. And this is an industry that's growing. We talked about, there's still a lot of research to be done. There's still a lot of work to do on carbon capture and storage on coal-fired facilities. But there's a lot of facilities out there, natural gas processing, ethanol, ammonia. They are going to start capturing CO2 within the next year. They're going to need a place to put it. Cement and steel. Yeah, so this is an industry that's moving forward. Okay, with that, I am going to stop talking. You guys have been a great audience. I really appreciate it. Should we take is there any last burning questions? Yes.
And in that chart you showed that you're capturing about 5% of the flue gas at dry port. What does it take to capture it all?
Okay, so I think maybe I wasn't as clear as I could have been.
Okay.
So the Dry Fork Station has about a flue gas percentage of 13% that's CO2. We want to capture about 90% of that 13%. Does that answer your question?
And that's what you're doing now?
That's what we hope to do.
So I think, Dale, you're referencing 5%, so, Dry Fork Station, has a gross capacity of about 440 megawatts, okay? And so, we take that emissions-ready flue gas, emissions-compliant flue gas, all of the oxides of nitrogen, oxides of sulfur, of mercury, all the particulate matter has been removed, so that gas is ready to go up the stack, and it'll be compliant with state and federal environmental regulations. We take 5% of that and we pull that off of that system. And we're able to distribute that out to our tenants or developers, 8 different locations within that overall proving grounds, within the ITC. And so we can give fractions of that gas to multiple developers, and they can have real live coal flavored flue gas, and their operations are integrated into that plant. When fuel quality changes, the emissions change. When load factor changes, the emissions change. When the weather changes and humidity, the flue gas changes. And so they're looking at the real deal. This is the ultimate test for their processes. Both the physiochemical processes and the economics be proven at that site. And if they win the horse race, they're ready to go commercial. So 5% of the total plant we can work with within the test center.
That's the amount going to the integrated testing.
We're effectively employing 5% of the 13%.
Right.
Of the emissions that are going.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. So, and again, if we were to go full-scale capture at Dry Fork Station and look to capture 90% of the flue gas, the scale up would be about a factor of 20 of the size of the facility we have here now.
What I was wondering about is ITC X Prize going on. How did that finalize? Is it done? Is it still going?
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Anybody know?
Yeah, so it is complete. So the first tenant that we had at the ITC was a private foundation called the Carbon X Prize. You might know them from the Space X Prize, and they've done several other projects associated with water development and vaccinations in third world countries. They look at big ideas. And what the X Prize Foundation did was identified this facility here in Gillette and another one at a place called Boundary Dam Power Station near Calgary. They took applications from around 50 or 60 different projects that wanted to come in and do a moonshot around CO2 capture and utilization of that CO2. They did merit-based down select of those initial applicants and ended up with 10 applicants, 5 here in Gillette, 5 near Calgary. And I mentioned horse race. They essentially had a horse race and said, how much CO2 can you capture at what price? And conversely, how much product can you produce and at what value? Rocketeer was a UCLA-based technology. The name of the company was, they were capturing CO2 in building products, in bricks. So they actually tweaked the chemistry, so to speak, of or bricks, so that those bricks would absorb CO2, mineralize the CO2 into the matrix of those blocks and lock it up permanently. So the technology in Canada, the one was also a cement-based technology. Yep, so that's all done. We've had it moved off
They
site.
utilized the test center to get that one?
They did. Yep, yep, it sure did.
So some of that funding went in to help it.
So,
I'm trying to understand where the money went.
so the money went to the developers, right? Yeah, so the Carbon X Prize award money went to those developers. So they ran their own program, funded their own program. We provided the space. Yeah.
So there's a new X Prize related, or I think it's related, it's $100 million prize now. And it, do you know where that one's located, or?
So that's the direct air capture one, right?
There's also one for, I mean, there's a few.
Oh, yeah, there's a lithium production one. Ben, I don't know where that's happening. Yeah. So interestingly enough, that, the idea that the Carbon X Prize used, I think originated, back in the time, the first, transatlantic airplane flights, nonstop transatlantic, when, did a history buff, it was Charles Lindbergh. Was it Lindbergh that went on that? Charles Lindbergh. So there was an event basically that companies that wanted to advance the aerospace industry said, hey, everybody that's crazy enough to fly across the Atlantic nonstop at that time, we'll put up this prize money. And I don't know what the prize, I think it was $50,000 or something. And they thought that $50,000 carrot hanging out there as a prize generated tens of millions of dollars of private investment for people that wanted to chase that prize money. That's what the X Prize does. What else?
What is the technology that Kawasaki is doing out there at ITC? What are they doing?
Good question. So we're talking about the Integrated Test Center, and the different types of technologies that are being evaluated on that site. So first of all, we're evaluating at different scales. We had Carbon X Prize tenants that were working at like sub 100 kilowatt. Your pickup's probably 300 or 400 kilowatt equivalent, right? Kilowatt to horsepower. So really, really small projects. We just received notice that there's a new award with a company called TDA. They've been selected for contract negotiations. It would be 25 megawatts. So various scales, but we also want to evaluate different technology pathways. I think Fred mentioned that going back 65, even 70 years, there have been amine solvent CO2 scrubbers. So it's a certain class of chemical that you flow through a contact tower, it absorbs the CO2, and then you manipulate heat and pressure to get that CO2 on and back off again. We don't really need to learn anything more about amine solvents. That is very, very well understood across the industry and across the globe. So we're looking at other things to reduce capital costs, to reduce operational costs. So Kawasaki brought a project. So this is Kawasaki Corporation that was using money provided to them by the Japanese Ministry of Environment, kind of the equivalent of our EPA, along with a private industry trade association. And they brought a technology that interestingly, they've been using for almost 40 years, I think, in other places where CO2 matters. Think about if you're in a submarine under the ocean for 2 or 3 months at a time. How are you going to deal with that CO2 from your respiration? They've been doing that. I believe they provided some of the CO2 capture equipment on the International Space Station. Difficult environments to work in, not near the scale that we're working here, but that technology is a solid sorbent. So we've got liquid solvents, solid sorbents. We've got membrane technology, which actually uses engineered membranes with some tricky surface chemistry that can actually filter that flue gas. So we talked about, 12 or 13% CO2 in the flue gas. Now the rest of the stuff coming out of that stack, what you see on a cold day, that white cloud, that's just water vapor. So the flue gas is around 1 or 2% oxygen. It's around 12 or 13% CO2, maybe 18 to 20% water in vapor phase, and then the rest of it's nitrogen. So those membranes can actually separate the gases, CO2 this way, nitrogen that way, water the other way, through these semi-permeable membranes. Maybe something similar to Gore-Tex, like your waterproof jacket or boots. So we purposely want to work with tenants that are evaluating a number of different technological pathways so we can find the best one.
So, I think you were talking about a little bit, but when it had the carbon capture from the plant, the drill holes for that big fancy thing there, where is your big cost? The capture?
I think, yes. Yeah, I mean, capture, that's the one where with technological advances, we get that cost down. Once we
reason I said that.
CO2, we know how to put it down a hole. Those costs are.
And that's the reason I said that, because it
Yeah.
seems like that needs to be the focus of this technology.
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly what the
It's how do you
ITC
get
is.
to capture economics towards?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you know better than anybody, Scott.
We know how to drill holes.
Capital costs versus operating costs. We're wanting to build a machine that we know can operate predictably from a cost standpoint over 30 or 40 or 50 years. That's how long a power plant lives. So the capital cost is a huge piece of it, but the energy requirements to operate is another big piece of that puzzle. So it's a balancing act.
I was gonna ask about how much power it takes to pump that down that far into the soil.
Right, good question. So the question was, how much power, how much energy does it take to deal with the CO2 once you have it? A couple different types of energy requirements or phases of energy requirements. First would be the capture. It looks right now like somewhere between 15 and maybe even 25% parasitic load on the plant. I mentioned Dry Fork Station. That's a 440 megawatt gross plant. Now they only get to sell 400 megawatts because to run their own machine, to make the power, they already have a parasitic load of 9, 10, 11%. It's possible that there could be another 20-ish% parasitic load on the plant to accomplish the capture, to accomplish the gas scrubbing, gas polishing, which is primarily dewatering, the compression, the transportation, the injection. It's a big load, and that will add to the cost of the power at the retail meter. That's for sure.
Is the CO2 that you're injecting pure? I mean, does it have to be from like a scrubber, or can it be?
So it's pretty pure. We talk about 2 nines or 3 nines type purity, 99% or 99.9% type of purity. If anybody took a chemistry class recently, you might deal with UHP type of calibration gases, ultra high purity gases that are maybe 4 or 5 nines type purity. Not really necessary for what we're doing. The biggest thing is get rid of water. Because CO2 and water is carbonic acid. It's no different than your Coca-Cola. That's why it eats the enamel off your teeth. Water is an issue from a purity perspective. That protects the compression and pipeline and wellbore infrastructure from corrosion.
That explosion of the CO2 pipeline in Mississippi a few years back? Did they do something wrong, or is that like an actual significant danger, or is it really not something to worry about?
I know of that event. I don't know, maybe you guys do too. It gets some attention. I think it probably gets more airtime than is deserved.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what went wrong there, but there are
There's a landslide.
a landslide broke the pipe in half. There you go.
So, CO2
infrastructure. I think Wyoming is probably kind of tied for third or fourth in terms of the scale or mass of our CO2 infrastructure. Texas and New Mexico Permian Basin has huge infrastructure. I think they move as much as maybe 15 million tons a year, CO2 in that region. Texas, Louisiana, Gulf Coast, kind of in the petrochemical arc there around the Gulf Coast. There's huge CO2 infrastructure there. In the Mid-Con in Oklahoma, centered in the Oklahoma region, there are, I would venture to guess, tens of thousands of miles of CO2 pipelines in the nation that have been running for 30 and 40 and 50 years.
But not to downplay it, I mean, obviously, a lot of stuff we do has a risk. Probably that incident actually changed the way the regulatory commission, made people model CO2 pipelines and made private operator, and I guess we're doing it up. They actually changed the way that they operate and monitor those 24/7, so, in that regard is a good thing. Nobody died, and they started to do things differently because they had to really recognize that risk there.
Yeah.
So the CO2 pipelines that we have in Wyoming, where are they captured?
So I believe the only location for capture right now is down in the Green River Basin. It's a facility called the Shoe Creek plant. It's owned and operated by Exxon. It's been in operation since the early 80s at least, and maybe a little before that on a smaller scale. Big natural gas field down there. Natural gas is always a mix of various gases. You want a lot of methane, but there can be other gases there as well, including CO2. That particular gas stream, what they call the Lavarge platform, has a lot of CO2. I think it's around 30% methane only.
Yeah, 23%.
23% methane. A lot of H2S. It's a sour gas, so hydrogen sulfide is a poisonous gas. Most interestingly, it has about 0.6% helium. And so that helium is very, very valuable. So they've got a big cryogenic treatment plant there to extract that helium. They take the methane gas off, sell it into natural gas pipelines, and they've got around 60 or 65% CO2 in that gas. And so they've already got it, so they've captured it, right, in natural gas processing. And so they sell that to all of these oil field customers, as I mentioned, across 4 states, 11 or 12 different oil fields. They sell that CO2, it's transported to depleted oil fields, which then utilize that to produce more oil.
Something that's interesting about that, Jim, is they don't sell all the CO2. They put a lot of it back in the ground.
That's right.
And they've been doing it for 20 years, and we're just gonna write on the paper, it's actually North America's largest CCS project. So they've been putting over 500,000 tons of CO2 in with the ground in both 2 wells for 2 decades.
Right. They'd love to sell more, but if there was market off-takers.
Okay, so we talk about risk management assessment, and what I was kind of thinking is we're burying it in the ground thousands of feet deep, and there's water below it inside the pore spaces, and is the water that's stored in there already pressurized, and how about the risk, how much risk is there that the pressurized gas, because if the water wasn't pressurized before, how vulnerable is the ground to letting out the CO2 gas? And let's say you said we had like 400 years of storage just for Wyoming. If we fill it up in 50 to 100 years and something happens, things happen, how dangerous could that be to our ecosystem?
So let me take a stab at that and then follow up. So that's a great question. You're thinking about it exactly right. The example I use oftentimes when people talk about that, does anybody know the history of the Kitty Field, the Kitty oil and gas field, just 5 miles north and west of Gillette? It was kind of made famous in an old John Wayne movie called Hellfighters. Nobody? Some fighters? John Wayne. Okay, so Dr. Fred mentioned these, 3,000 or 4,000 feet of marine shales that overlie typically what we understand as our oil and gas producing zone. impermeable. There's other siltstones that are impermeable. And we know that those are impermeable. Absolutely nothing is getting through those cap rocks or seals, because back in the 60s, when they drilled that well, just right behind the airport, basically, that well blew in. It was like the old-time spindle top, oil and gas and water shooting out of the ground, blowing over the top of the rig, ran everybody off the rig, eventually ended up burning it down. And that's what they captured in this film of this big rig fire. That was for real. That was, nationwide news coming out in play. Those fluids, that water, that gas, that oil were under tremendous pressure, actually overpressured from a hydrostatic basis, so much so that when they finally drilled into that and broke the seal, so to speak, they weren't ready for it, it blew out of the ground. Okay, so the issue is with a properly sited, properly designed and constructed wellbore, if good engineers do it, and we've got 80, 90 years of oil field heritage in the state that's already learned all those lessons about how to remove gigaton scales of fluids out of these same rocks. You just have to take that idea and turn it upside down and inside out and put fluids back in with those same lessons we've learned. So one of the things that they'll monitor with the monitoring, verification, and reporting processes is the frac grading, right? So go ahead and elaborate on that if you like.
All right, so that's a really complex and layered question. Good question. So yeah, so you're putting, it really is, so you're putting a fluid in something that's already full of fluid. So you're displacing water when that happens. Now the simple answer on this is you have a ceiling that's already determined by the sensitivity of the rocks, which we call the fraction gradient. You're not allowed to come anywhere near that. You have to stay 10% below that fraction gradient all the time. You're monitoring the whole time. If you come anywhere near that, you shut down operations immediately, and it will happen for CCS. So there's kind of a check and a balance in that activity. We also come up with pressure management plans. So if you're displacing those fluids, you can also co-produce those fluids around the field potentially. But yeah, it's certainly a concern with CCS, and it's something that you have to have a strategy to plan for and prove that you can do it in real time, 24/7, 365 before they let you do any CO2 injection. Now, the unfortunate thing, Jim, is probably, your example of Kitty, hopefully won't be as exciting, and CO2 is not flammable anyways. So there's probably not going to be any John Wayne playing Scott Cooling in one day, but I hope so.
Yeah, and the main point there being that those fluids in the deep subsurface have been there forever, right? Pick a time, it's 10,000 years or 10 jillion years or something in between. Those fluids, what we know, can be trapped under pressure and do not come out unless someone screws up. So that's why we apply good engineering principles, good geologic study way ahead of time on these projects. Good question.
Thank you.
What else?
I do have one more. Oh, go ahead. I do have one more possible concern. Is it taken into consideration of a possible negative feedback loop where, so if Gillette is storing all of their carbon emissions, it's obvious that we're going to want to increase the capacity of Dry Fork Station in the future in order to store more carbon efficiently, because instead of building more than one or multiple more carbon capture plants. And in that it takes energy to store the emissions, and then we're going to have more emissions being emitted from storing those.
Right, you're saying, is the problem snowballing because it requires that we burn more coal to produce more power because we're loading that system with additional parasitic?
Yeah, is that a concern?
It's a good question, and in certain ways, what it's going to mean is if we produce the same amount of power, we produce the same amount of emissions overall, but there's less less of it makes it to your meter, there's less of it makes it to the factory, there's less of it makes it, to the lights in this building. And I would say, think about that in terms of efficiency of cost of production and availability of the end product, which is electrons, right? So, there's effectively no issue that we're going to make the problem bigger and worse and that it snowballs through this method. It does impact cost and it impacts where we employ that energy.
So, yeah, so another complex question, well done. So it could be a whole lecture series, but there's a series of what we call life cycle assessments to measure carbon intensity, right? The carbon intensity of this bottle we can quantify. So yeah, we don't look to ever go above the carbon intensity, as far as we know, will be significantly decreased right now, with this technology, bolted on.
So let me add just a little bit of that. And so that's a great question. And I love your theory. I'd love to see you down at the University of So looking over the horizon, so one of those technologies that's out there that is under development and kind of a concept is this concept of co-firing biomass with coal. And so you take a biomass, say it's a switchgrass or it's an ethanol. It's something that was grown. And so you grow this switchgrass, it pulls CO2 out of the air. You co-fire it or co-burn it with coal. And then when you capture those carbon emissions and put them down whole, you're actually carbon negative. So it's a carbon negative technology. So it kind of takes you the other direction.
Yeah. There's a group that is part of the University of Wyoming called the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute. I think they were commissioned how long ago? Maybe 30 or more years ago. To think about things about how we get more oil out of the same old rocks. And that means one of the things that they think about a lot is CO2 utilization. Now I know that 15 or 20 years ago we used to think about CO2 floods for EOR on metrics of saying for every ton of CO2 we put in the ground, we want to get a couple of barrels of oil back. And that's an economic consideration. Now the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute has gone back and kind of reanalyzed a lot of their prior work and have said there are fields in Wyoming that they have a good understanding of the remaining reserves in place, the operating costs. There's some assumptions, but there are models where you could use CO2 captured from a place like Dry Fork, go back into certain oil fields, and actually put away more CO2 and permanently store it than would be produced from burning the oil that you recover. And the concept of having a CO2 negative barrel of oil is real.
Mine is just simple, since we're all talking geology terms, it seems that there's one huge mountain to get over as well, and that is reputation, an undeserved reputation of usage of fossil fuels in any sort. It seems like there's a whole project and issue to deal with there.
Yeah, in terms of, again, the question, why are we doing these things?
Right.
There are global narratives around fossil fuels. There are social and political and regulatory realities that are coming to bear on fossil fuels. Okay? There are also market realities competing with other sources of energy. There could be some reputation rebuilding relative to fossil fuels, but one thing that's not going to change anytime soon, not in any of our lifetimes, is the world is even more hungry every day for sources of energy that are abundant, that are affordable, that are reliable, and more so about being, having a low life cycle carbon intensity. These are just some of the realities of the modern world. And so we've got to rethink what we do and how we do it, in my opinion. The last 50 years in Wyoming, in the Powder River Basin, have been nothing but up every year. from a 1973 model. In 1973, we exported our first significant volumes of coal to markets outside of this basin. And it's always been more coal, more oil, more natural gas, higher prices, more CBM, more coal, another gas discovered. Okay. But all those things provide our jobs, they provide our tax revenues, they have built a wonderful community. From when my folks moved here in 1968, I think there were 2 paved roads, and Mom wanted to pack her bags and go back to Billings like the first week. Minerals have built a wonderful, wonderful community here in Gillette. And we've got that foundation to build from. Times change, they always have.
I guess I got one more question. Won't this just speed up the eventual transition to nuclear power? Because if you're wasting 20% of your fuel, then, I mean, eventually physics wins anyway, and the most energy dense fuel will be used. So it seems like this kind of stuff just, speeds up the transition to nuclear.
Yeah, I don't know about speed. I'm a big nuke fan. I don't know what Candace would think, but I'd let him build one in my backyard. I have no reservations at all about nuclear power.
Talk about a reputation issue.
We all know people that have lived and worked and eaten and, drank and sleep within tens of feet of nuclear reactors in our nuclear navy. I'm a big nuke fan, but we gotta get there.
Just comes out economics.
Yeah.
Let's get the last words from our panelists who joined us from the University of Wyoming as we close out the evening stuff.
Well, I just want to thank you all for having us up here, and thank you for inviting us up. I'd just like to extend the invitation to anybody that wants to come down to Laramie and visit School of Energy Resources or learn more about our programs. We'd love to have you down